Sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm your host, Ari Schaefer. It's my pleasure to be doing a special episode today on Yale's post-military student population with our first-time guests, Valerie Calderon-Meyer.
Hello.
And Galen Jones.
Hi, Ari.
First of all, thank you both for your service. And thanks for joining me on the podcast. It's great to have you. So first, can you both just talk about your military service and what you did before you started here at Yale? Valerie, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Valerie. I was in the United States Navy from 2015 to 2022. Did a little over 6.5 years. My first duty station was Japan. I was stationed on board the USS Ronald Reagan, which is an aircraft carrier. Spent 3 years in the Pacific Ocean. Really rewarding time in the Navy. And then I went to San Diego, worked for IWTG as an assessor.
IWTG?
Yeah, that's Information Warfare Training Group. So we train sailors on electronic warfare and anti-ship missile defense. That was my specialty.
Galen?
Of course. First of all, thanks for having me, Ari. Pleasure to be here. I served 9 years in the Army. Right out of high school, I enlisted as a combat medic, did a short stint in the 82nd Airborne before going to selection for Special Forces, where I spent the rest of my time as a Special Forces medic in Germany. So I was with 1st Battalion, 10 Special Forces Group, working kind of all across Eastern Europe.
Wow. So what made you guys decide to leave the military?
So there were a lot of reasons. I left actually in January of 2022 and had not felt like I was having the impact that I particularly wanted to at the time. There was a lot of opportunity outside that I saw that I felt like I could have an impact and decided that I would make better use of my time.
How about you, Valerie?
I agree. I think being enlisted had a lot to do with it. I think Navy is a really traditional place, really values tradition. I didn't really see myself blossoming to my full potential as an enlisted sailor in the Navy, and I thought I initially enlisted for education benefits and wanted to do 4 years to feel a sense of service to my country. So, and I felt like I accomplished that. So
Valerie, you're not enlisted. You're enrolled at Yale as an undergrad. Obviously, a lot of the other undergrads at Yale are a little bit younger than you, less experienced than you. What's the social experience like? What's the social life like being surrounded by undergrads who are much younger than you?
So socially, it can be a little tricky. I made a lot of undergrad friends my first year. I think it feels pretty good. I won't lie. It's not too difficult navigating relationships and friendships. As an undergrad, I think most of it is just the depth. It's a matter of depth in the relationship. I think in the Navy, for example, friendships are made off of going through tough times together. And I think on the outside, in civilian life, it's more on what you have in common with somebody else. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. It's not impossible to make meaningful connections on the outside, though. My roommate is a traditional undergrad, and I love her dearly. Shout out to Ria. But yeah, it's not impossible. It's just fewer and far in between.
Do you find yourself gravitating towards other veterans, or are most of your friends just traditional undergraduates?
I think lately I find myself more... I guess most of my friends are graduates or PhD students who are within my age group. I think I feel more deeper connections in that way. But yeah, I do have some undergrad friends as well.
How about you, Galen? You're in a master's program, so obviously the students you're with are not all, but some are older, some have worked before, some have other experience. Obviously not all military. What's the social life like from your perspective?
It's interesting because I've been very lucky in the regard that I'm part of a different communities, being a dual degree. both public health and school business, and they're very different communities. School business, the average age is about 28, public health 24, different dynamics. And so school management, I've had a very, I think, easy time fitting in. About 10% of the student body are veterans.
Oh, wow.
So it's a very high percentage, and I think it's increasing. I think they're bringing in more veterans as time goes on. So it's already part of the community. And because people are older, they've had a little bit more work experience, it's been pretty easy just to come right in and become part of the community. It has been at times a little bit more difficult within the School of Public Health because there is a large age gap. In a lot of ways, it's like the undergrad. There's a lot of people who have come straight from undergrad into this program. But oftentimes I do feel it's more based on the age than the military experience.
Interesting.
People don't know oftentimes how to handle the military experience, but they're very open to learning about it. And it doesn't actually pose a barrier between friendships at all.
So I looked up some of the data. I saw numbers from last November. There are around 170 student veterans, 120 in the grad schools, 50 undergrad was the number I saw. Do you feel like there's a veterans community? You mentioned, 10% of the business school is, I think, law school is around 9%, undergrad, 50 out of 6,500 is not particularly large. Is there a veterans community that you guys have connected into?
Yeah, so I'm part of a cohort here called the Eli Whitney cohort. I think this year we got 60% veterans in the Eli Whitney body alone, which is a huge number of veterans. So in the undergraduate community, we do have an influx of veterans.
Do they help you find each other?
We all come in together, so we're like a team. I think it feels like you always have a community of people to relate to.
How about you, Galen? You said 10% of the business school are veterans. Do you find each other? Do they help you find each other? How does that work?
Yeah, we have a pretty strong veterans club. I mean, right off the bat, they help with recruiting to even come to the school in the first place. And then once we're here, we throw a couple events here and there, have swag. And there is a community. We go have drinks, help each other out in different stages of the recruiting process. It's fairly strong there. There's less veterans in the School of Public Health, which means the couple of us that are there are very tight, but it is a very small community. I think you'll see across the grad schools at Yale, there's different strengths within the veteran community. I know law school has a very, very strong veterans club. Business school also does have one. But if there's no veterans, it's just not going to be quite as strong. There's also the community kind of across Yale, which I know Yale has been making an effort to bring veterans across grad schools together, but it's not quite at the full strength yet. It's still taking time to kind of make those connections and build those relations between clubs.
Yeah.
So how is Yale in terms of, I guess, helping meet the needs of veterans? I imagine there are things that, most of your college experience, despite the age difference, notwithstanding the age difference, is fairly similar to other undergrads, other grad students. But I imagine there are probably also things that are unique to the veterans experience, whether, just the kind of things you got used to in the military, or, dealing with post-military, bureaucracy, paperwork. Is Yale good about that? Are they understanding? Do they know? Do they appreciate it? How does Yale administratively handle the needs of its veteran students?
I think in my experience, Yale College, for the most part, has been really accommodating with student accessibility accommodations. For one, they welcome veterans. They understand that well. And Captain Holly Hermes, she's the Yale liaison for veteran and military affairs. And Jennifer Van Brederode, she helps veterans navigate education benefits, which really helped me a lot when I first came here. So shout out to both of them. They make the transition a lot easier. But I think those positions are pretty recent from what I've gathered. But I think Yale's making some big strides for veterans, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well. Exactly what Valerie was saying. I know those positions are very new, and Holly and Jen have done a remarkable job. I've worked with them quite a little bit recently, and they have supported me on a couple events. With basically, without question, tons of resources.
Yeah.
It's been pretty remarkable. I know also Yale has brought in not only the new roles, but they could have a new office over by Maury's, and have shown pretty real dedication to increasing the veteran support and community across campus.
Yeah, I've noticed, I haven't put a lot of research into it, but I have noticed, mentions of the veteran community in places I didn't expect. I was reading, a speech by Heather Gerken at the law school, and she went out of her way to mention this in a context where, otherwise, didn't necessarily call for it. And it does seem like Yale is doing their best to try and attract post-military students, attract veterans. So I'm glad to hear that you guys feel that as well.
Yeah, I'll also say at the School of Public Health, when I started with a couple other people, the Veterans Club there, and the administration was so ecstatic about that, helped me out, put a lot of time and resources to doing that. And there's a lot of partnerships that you don't hear about, with the VA especially. There's a very tight relationship there. So there's a lot of things that we may not quite hear about, but are ongoing quite often.
So I do want to move on to, campus culture around the military and around service members. You look through American history, campuses are often the center of protests against the military, against protests against military action. And you look at the 60s and 70s in particular, and that sometimes bled into how students and young people treated people who served in the military also. From that sense, from a, political or social culture around the military, how do you guys feel being on campus?
I feel comfortable. I don't think I've ever had any issues as an undergrad. I think my experiences have been pretty welcomed. People are curious about it. There are some times when some students, I think, feel daunting. It's like a daunting thing. A lot of them are surprised to find out that I'm not a traditional undergrad student. So when I tell them, I'm 27 years old, they're like, whoa.
Do you take that as a personal compliment?
I do, but yeah. Wear SPF every day. It does wonders. Life hack. But, and then comes the question, well, what did you do after high school? And, I was in the Navy for 7 years. And that's like, whoa. I think a lot of the kids here are traditional undergrads. That's, I think, completely different from a lot of their life experiences. And it might be hard to navigate, but I've never taken it in a way where I've never taken it personal, where it's people separate themselves because they don't agree with my life decisions. Rather, they just don't really know how to identify or what to do with that.
Right. They don't have that experience. And when you're, I remember when I was fresh out of high school, I could talk about the 17 things I did as a high school senior and literally nothing else. So I guess.
Yeah. So I imagine it's a little bit intimidating for some of the younger students.
It's discomfort because of lack of familiarity.
Yes,
and that's
exactly.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
But I'm also surprised by how many people also push through that. And they ask questions which, one, are oftentimes really hard to answer, like, what was the military like? It's where do you even start with that? But at the very least, people are curious and they ask those questions, and those are going to lead to more questions, and then you start to build that. Because a lot of people here have not had experiences with the military. They don't have family. They don't have friends who have joined. And so it's a completely brand new thing. And that is one of the strengths of having so many veterans here at Yale, is we can bring those experiences and at least give people a little bit of exposure.
It is a strength. Yeah, I think in regards to just anti-military mindsets, I think it provides a different perspective. Hey, we're human too, and we're not we're not big, scary soldiers and sailors. We're also women and smaller people, shy people. But I think it could be a refreshing perspective for a lot of the student body.
Right, because I remember reading, or you can look at the statistics. There are a couple million people in the DoD who are non-civilian, and the number of people who are on active duty is much lower than that. I don't know the exact number offhand, but probably a few 100,000, maybe a little bit higher. But that either way, that adds up to a very small percentage of the U.S. population.
Yeah,
and that's often concentrated in certain demographic groups and certain income groups, and that means a lot of people who come to Yale just don't have that kind of military experience in their background. Yeah. Is that something you find that the students you interact with really just have, like you said, don't know where to start?
Yeah, often they don't know where to start. It's the same thing where they're asking broad questions of how do I even approach this giant topic? But I found, especially in the undergrad, I've had the lucky experience of being a graduate affiliate at Grace Hopper and taking a couple classes as undergraduates. they have gotten, most of the students I've talked to are very good at approaching big subjects they're not comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in the School of Public Health, I've had a little bit of difficulties with people not knowing quite how to do that. And I've breached subjects that are oftentimes quite difficult and people don't understand when you're talking war and the pragmatism of how many global geopolitical events go down. It's oftentimes, if you don't have those experiences, it's hard to relate. And I will say there's a lot of people who it's hard to mesh those, but almost every single time people approach me and be like, hey, let's sit down and talk this through. Let's find some way for me to understand. I want to hear this. I want to hear you talk more about it, which I found quite remarkable. I've been in a lot of circumstances where people really want to fight outside of Yale and don't really want to listen to the other side of it. And across the board here, I have found nothing but the opposite of people wanting to sit down and actually understand.
How often do you guys bring your military experience into discussions in class? After you go like, well, we're talking about this. When I was in the military, like this is what the experience was like.
I've never had to talk about like foreign policy or anything that I really did in the Navy. If anything, I actually I make a little game of it where I don't tell anybody until the questions start coming. I like to see how long I can go just pretending I'm an undergrad, or a traditional undergrad. But I mean, it'll just come up in little things like we're reading Chaucer, and one tells like lowbrow humor, and I talk about how in the Navy everything's lowbrow humor. Yeah, so that'll just be a way that I pop in and like, oh, by the way, I was in the Navy and everything was toilet humor.
Casually drop that you like served for like 7 years.
Yeah, exactly, just to relate to Chaucer. But.
How are you, Galen? Does it come up?
A lot more than I thought it would. I actually got cold called for being in the military today in class.
Really?
Today, this morning, yeah. And I had not mentioned it in class.
Right.
The instructor at one point had looked at all our profiles and targeted us because it showed a very clear understanding of like kind of what military culture was. He was talking about leadership and owning leadership and being responsible about that, and asked, hey, Galen, you served in the military. What do you think about how this leader is approaching this situation? I also do bring it up sometimes. I think I'm very much in the same boat as Valerie, where it's not something I really want to bring up quite often. If it's very applicable, I will. Mm-hmm. But one, you don't want to be known as the guy who's always talking about, back in the military. When I was in the military. Yeah. And sometimes it just doesn't, it's not applicable. More often than not, we're not in situations where it even does add value. But when it does, I do try and make a concerted effort to go outside, I guess, my own comfort zone of saying these things, because it is, again, another perspective that needs to be told and shared. And there are a lot of times where there is a large value add.
Galen, after you left the military, you ended up in Ukraine for a year and a half, 2 years?
So I did 2 different stints. They're both very short. So the first one was 2 weeks, very short. And the second one was about 3 months.
So you went after Russia invaded. Do people talk about Russia, Ukraine casually, informally? Do you ever bring up your time working out there?
Not too often. I definitely have. There's been a lot of circumstances where we have been talking about, especially the early kind of humanitarian aid side of things within the public health or a few of the Jackson classes I've taken, where it's hard to get a picture of just how chaotic that world is from the academic side. Because you're sitting back, you're reading journals, you're reading stories, and it all seems like it's lining up. But when you're on the ground, you see the absolute chaos going on and how nothing quite makes sense. And there's all kinds of bad actors there and people doing great work and people doing less than great work. And it ends up kind of lining up into the story that you hear, but actually being on the ground and seeing these first-hands and having those experiences really does shed light on a lot of those events.
So actually, obviously, it's not at all the same as serving in the military, but my background is in politics. And so sometimes when I hear discussions about politics, even at our own events, people talk about the way things are or like what things should be in politics. I'm like, that's not at all how these things work. Right? When you're in it, like people think about these things very differently. Have you guys had any of those experiences based on your military experience? You come into a class and someone's talking about something or listening to a lecture and saying like, well, this is, this war fighting, this is what our strategy should be. And then kind of reflecting on your own time and going like, well, this is actually how it works. And so like maybe that vision of things, it doesn't actually make sense.
I think for me, my conversation with my friend was a little bit similar, the one on whether or not women should be drafted or enlist in service. I think I think during Ben Shapiro's talk when he came here on campus, I think he put it pretty well that there's a culture of virtue signaling, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think there is a a culture of virtue signaling on campus. I think it's important to consider a lot of, I think, at least for the younger students, there's a little bit of a bubble at institutions like Ivy League institutions like Yale, and it's important to consider how these opinions form, and if they're based off of real life experience.
So we'll kind of, I guess, wrap up with this question. Like, if there was like one or two things that, you wish your classmates knew, doesn't, not necessarily crucial to your life, but something that you wish they knew about what it's like to have served in the military that you think maybe would, overcome those gaps, those like, those kind of the barrier, what would you suggest?
I think for me, I would just say, again, it seems daunting, I guess, to approach people who have served or to interact with them. But I think it's important to remember that we were all really young when most of us were really young when we enlisted too, and like I said earlier, like we're all human. So don't be shy, and come up and say hi. And I think it's better to approach and gain new perspectives that way.
Galen?
I think this is about the third time Valerie has said something that I was planning to say. But yeah, I said a similar thing is ask the questions. We like talking about our experiences in the military and sharing it. And it can seem intimidating, but we'll yap. We'll get out there and talk and share the experiences. We really like it. It was a big part of our lives for a long period of time, and we want people to understand why we did what we did, what it means to us, how it's shaped us, everything kind of related to it. So come ask questions. I promise you, once you get to know us, we are less than intimidating.
They're just like everyone else.
Yeah.
Well, Galen, Valerie, thanks so much for joining me. I found this conversation particularly meaningful. So thanks for all you did.
Yeah,
thanks for your
so
service.
much, Ari.
Thank you.
And now we'll move to our interview with Peter Dutton at Yale Law School on his path from the military to the academy and the future of U.S.-China relations. I'd like to welcome Peter Dutton to Pod and Man at Yale. Peter Dutton is a senior research scholar in law and senior fellow in the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School. Before coming to Yale, he was professor of international law at the Stockton Center for International Law at the U.S. Naval War College, where he served as interim dean of the Center for Naval War Studies and as director of the China Maritime Studies Institute. He's a 40-year veteran of the U.S. Navy in both active and military and civilian capacities. Thanks for your service, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for saying that, and thanks for your support. Yeah.
So first I want to talk to you about your military experience. Can you talk about where you served and what you did on active duty?
Sure. Well, I started in the Reagan administration as an aviator. I spent 6 years on active duty during the end of the Cold War. I flew a variety of aircraft, naval jets, from the A6 to the A4. And
were you taking off aircraft carriers?
So at that time, no. I was actually based in Key West, Florida for my operational tour, and in Norfolk, Virginia for additional follow-on tours. So nope. I did, in fact, take off on an aircraft carrier later, though, and that was when I was a lawyer. Just taking off in jets for various reasons or aircraft, I should say, not even jets, aircraft for various reasons to take care of the Navy's business.
Were you ever in combat or?
Not technically, no. I mean, I was deployed with the John F. Kennedy strike group. It's now referred to as strike group. At the time, it was referred to as a battle group to the Persian Gulf during Operation Southern Watch. So this was in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, and we were enforcing sanctions against Iraq and also against Iran. And technically, it was a combat situation, but nobody was shooting at me as I was on the aircraft carrier most of the time.
I mean, that's amazing. Thank you for doing that. These important jobs, enforcing sanctions, or even just there are a million things that need to get done for the military to function, and it's incredible that you dedicated so much time to it.
I appreciate that. It was a really incredible time period. To see the way events are unfolding, up front and firsthand, I should say, to see how global events that affected everything about how we thought about the world at that time were unfolding right up front. It was incredible.
So part of your experience in the military, and I think you kind of referenced that I saw in your bio, you were a judge advocate.
Yeah.
What exactly is that? Just
It's
out
a lawyer.
Curiosity.
It's a lawyer. So, the term for a lawyer in the military is a judge advocate. The judge advocate general is the senior lawyer in the service.
Is that like JAG?
That's what JAG stands for, Judge Advocate General, right? So the shorthand, often the lawyer is referred to as JAG, but the correct term actually is Judge Advocate. But you're part of what's called the Judge Advocate General's Corps, right? Mm-hmm. So you work for the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, in my case, or Army or Air Force, et cetera. So often you're just referred to by the shorthand of JAG, but you are a judge advocate, and that just means lawyer.
What kind of issues were you working on?
Oh, golly. So first of all, because I was an aviator first, I transitioned into the JAV Corps. I went to law school because I was selected for something called the Law Education Program. The Navy paid both my law school education and my salary during that time, which made it possible, frankly, for me to go to law school, because by then I was married and had 2 little kids. And so I went to, just at the end of the Cold War, between 1990 and 93, I went to law school. I went to the College of William and Mary, the law school there, Marshall Wythe School of Law, because I was stationed in Norfolk, as I mentioned. And I was asked to go to the nearest university with state support. So that was it. And
how far is it from Norfolk?
It's a little less than an hour drive from.
Okay.
Yeah. So so in fact I commuted. I didn't even bother moving. I went to the Marshall Wythe School of Law at the College of William and Mary, and from there I went into prosecution. This was not something I selected. It is what I was selected to do. But it turned out to be a really excellent experience of learning how to be a good lawyer in the courtroom, but also how to write persuasive briefs to make sure that motions go your way. Mm-hmm. And I was doing a lot of the more serious criminal prosecutions in the Washington, D.C. area. I was the senior prosecutor in Washington, D.C. at the time, even though I was the most junior. The way the military works, most junior lawyer. The way the military works is I was the most senior prosecutor by rank, even though I was the least experienced prosecutor. So I was put into the most senior position, and I learned a lot from having to manage people who knew more than me, which was a really good experience, actually.
So at a certain point, you transitioned into academia.
Yeah.
What was that transition like? How'd you go from being a judge advocate to academic life? Did the military help you there? Was it something you just wanted to do?
Yeah, it was a pretty gentle transition in some ways. As I said, I was a prosecutor, but really in my heart, I wanted to get into international law as soon as I could. The Navy had other plans. The Navy sent me to teach law at what's called the Naval Justice School in Newport, and that's a sort of transition law school program for new lawyers coming from civilian institutions, generally right out of law school, into the military, where you learn additional military law and the application of federal law in the military context.
What was the transition like? Just from like a day-to-day, the experience of being in the military to being a civilian, in an academic context? So
there's actually kind of 2 ways to answer that. One is being a civilian working for the government is different from being on active duty working for the government, for sure. But then there's another step, which is being an academic. A civilian academic is really different as well. So the transition from civilian, from being active duty to civilian, honestly, the strongest thing, and it was something I didn't expect, was the sense of I just wasn't responsible for everything anymore. As a naval officer, it's just sort of ingrained in you that you are responsible for the outcome of the mission of the organization that you're a part of, and period. End of discussion.
A lot of responsibility, a lot of weight.
It is. And you don't realize how much of that you carry around until you retire and put on a suit and realize, wow, whew. I was carrying a lot, for a long time. And then when you you're responsible for your work and the quality of your work and everything. And that's just really different from being sort of responsible for the conduct of the mission of your command. And that's how officers are thought of, in the Navy. And I think in all services, you're thought of as bearing that responsibility, whether you're specifically tasked for any aspect of it or not, you're still responsible for its, ensuring its accomplishment. There were some real noted differences. One of them was, as a military officer, you're kind of used to people doing what they're told, period, end of discussion, right? It's not like everybody, orders don't fly all the time. It's not how that works. But it is, you don't question you do what you're told because that's your job, right?
Right.
And you're responsible to your senior, officer for your job and for the performance of it, as I said earlier, in the mission of the command. As an academic, a civilian academic, your whole ethos is different. You're sort of looking for academic integrity, academic freedom, et cetera. And so your focus is on on your own personal academics and your own personal academic growth and scholarship, the growth of your scholarship. It's a really different mindset, and working with it's a lot like herding cats, as they say, as opposed to a team of on a dog sled, right? Where the military is more like the team of dogs at a dog sled, everybody harnessed in the same direction. Whereas herding cats is, Kyle, you just hope for the best. That's such a big difference. Yeah, and well, as dean, I learned that. Well, I learned this a lot earlier, but certainly it came home as dean. You understand that really what you have is influence, right? You don't have control. Whereas in the military leadership, you have a lot more control. You don't need to worry about influence. It's positional. But as working with civilian academics, it's a very different approach, and it's not a criticism. It's just a different ethos. Yeah.
So when you left the Naval War College, and then you moved to Yale. You've been there for, I guess, 6 months?
Yeah, since September 1st.
So September 1st. You're not teaching yet, but you were mentioning before we started that you're planning on teaching soon. But how has that transition been, or what are the differences you've noticed in an academic setting that at least is military in mindset and military orientation to a university that does have military students? We'll talk to more about that in a second.
Sure.
But doesn't have a military mindset at all.
I kind of notice a lot more similarities than differences. Probably the difference here is you'd be surprised, actually. Within the military, there's, probably the average student in the military is somewhat more conservative than the average student here at Yale or at NYU.
Interesting.
But that's mostly... it may, at least in part, have to do with age and experiences, but because what you really see in the military is a pretty significant reflection of the diversity of American society. You see that in the military as well. If I had to say, does it lean a little to the right or a little to the left? Probably a little to the right, but not a whole lot less than I think how some people stereotypically view it. You might say the same thing here at Yale. A lot of people sort of stereotype Yale as leaning hard to the left. And I find in the student body so far in my interactions that that's an oversimplification.
So I do want to, what is the biggest, cultural difference, not in terms of politics, just kind of things that being in the military, and I talked to some of the undergrads about, or the students who are undergrad in the grad school about this, some of the mindset differences that someone who'd spent so much time in the military would have that just might seem alien or unusual to another student, not in a judgmental or bad way, just kind of like this is a life experience that my colleagues, my students might not understand.
I think some of it has to do with just how, what the experiences are that you've been through. There's no way that you can't spend time in the military and avoid being highly disciplined with your time, with your, just with most aspects of your life. You inculcate discipline. When I went to law school, I was a little older than the average student. I started when I was 29, just almost 30. And I had spent 6 years on active duty at that point. And the average student, at the time was probably 23 or 24, maybe even younger, coming right out of their undergraduate education. And I found that law school was pretty manageable. If you're used to working hard work, right? For, in a disciplined way from, early morning to, dinner time. You can do law school quite effectively that way. And I didn't find in fact, I found I had a lot more time for my, family, because of that discipline. Whereas a lot of my classmates found the discipline a little harder to achieve. So that's one example of some of the sort of cultural differences. I think you've also, in many cases, you've experienced risk in ways that others might not have.
Interesting.
Right? Some of it's just as, it's not even necessarily being shot at, or being in a war zone. It's, well, first of all, some of the people in their training, they jump out of airplanes, risk. Other people in their training, like myself, naval aviation, even the 1980s when I was an aviator, we lost a lot of people, even in normal training cycles and operational accidents. And so you learn, you gain a little perspective from that acceptance of risk. These are some of the qualities that I'm sure many of the students here at Yale will eventually, come to some similar level of discipline and risk acceptance, et cetera. But the average student probably is different in that regard. Yeah.
So I want to get to your subject area, which is China, because, it's always in the news, and obviously China's a serious consideration from foreign policy perspective. We'll have to cover a lot in a very short amount of time, so we'll do what we can. So I guess the first question to kind of start off, level set us, like how strong is China, militarily, economically? How do you think that might change in the coming years?
Wow. Okay.
Simple starter question.
Yeah. So simple. So China's a very strong military power, but you have to kind of think about what exactly that means. China has a very strong military structure focused on its region and on the capacity to coerce Taiwan if necessary. That's what China's military is structured primarily around. There's a lot of worry that China is becoming a global military power. I think it's too soon to begin to seriously worry about that. So in some senses, when you compare the American military and the Chinese military, you're comparing apples to oranges because of the difference in the focus. America has a global military with global focuses. China has a very focused military. And yet China's military is very strong. Going forward in the future, a lot's going to depend on the evolution of technologies and how they're adapted into military service. But that's probably a whole separate podcast.
Is China something you think the U.S. should be concerned about? And obviously that's a very broad question. Is China a threat to the United States at any level, strategic, actual, how do you see that?
Well, yeah, China, America should be concerned about China, and there are senses in which China can be a threat to the United States. So, of concern, any growing power that has the capacity to challenge American power around the world is something that we should be concerned about, especially one with such a very different outlook on how the world should be governed and organized as China does. How power should be organized, and so power flows from economic strength, and so as China's economy continues to grow, it's really struggling, I acknowledge, but as China's economy continues to grow, it will become more powerful, and therefore we have to be concerned about it. Eventually, too. China's focus, like the Eye of Sauron, will shift from Taiwan per se to other things around the world that may be more direct, threats to our concerns. And so, we have a very serious interest in the future of Taiwan, but we have other concerns that China may be focused on more directly in the future. So, yes, we have to worry about China.
So there's a lot of dimensions to this, obviously, and you touched on a bunch, but I'll start with the economic concern, because that's the one that dominates a lot of the headlines. They're on one level, there's like very tangible considerations, which are, intellectual property theft, talking about the tariffs, dumping of products, cheap labor. And then there's the more global questions, more philosophical questions, as you mentioned, about two different economic systems and, the centrality of capitalism to the American Western identity versus the system, however you describe it, that China has, and how that's kind of central to their identity. Is there a way, how do you think, I guess, the two countries are going to handle that aspect, the economic aspect of their relationship? Is there a way you think both countries can move forward and handle this so it doesn't increase tension, or is it inevitable?
I think tension's inevitable, but I think we also can find ways to manage the tensions along the way. We're going to have to. I mean, our economies are so linked inextricably. I think it would be both nearly impossible and even disastrous to try to separate the two economies completely. Additionally, I think, oddly enough, each economy could benefit from learning something from the other. China has really hampered the private enterprise aspect of its economy over the last decade. Xi Jinping, in particular, has put a lot more pressure on private enterprise in China, and China's economy needs more private enterprise in order to succeed. Similarly, we need better industrial planning here, I think. I think it's the only way to compete with another a country the size of China with the capacity to plan how it's going to allocate resources. We need to think a little bit about our own industrial policies and how we can best use some of those to maximize our productivity as well.
So we're coming close to time, so I'm going to leave you with a simple question, obviously. Sure. Mm-hmm. What do you think the U.S.-China relationship is like in 10 years? Is it worse than it is now, better? And what are the kind of things that you think we would have to do, the U.S. and China, to put it on a better track?
Well, that's a huge question. That's not a nice leave me at the door question. So oh boy! I mean, everything is so contingent. We don't know what the relationship's going to be like in 10 years. I think we're going to still be in a cycle of competition. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be strategic competition, meaning it'll have elements of military, elements of political, and elements of economic aspects to it. I think so. I think a lot of what we're seeing today we will continue to see. I think there will be, I suspect, some kind of military crisis before that time is over. Whether that escalates into something beyond a localized crisis, or whether it doesn't, whether it's able to be contained, will depend a lot on the personalities involved. Xi Jinping won't be in power forever. Neither will Donald Trump. We don't know what the personalities after that will be like, but there will be structural concerns within the relationship, structural tensions that are built into the relationship that will be that will define what the competition will look like, and it'll be across all of the elements of power throughout the next decade, I'm sure.
Well, thanks so much for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. Thank you again for your service. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate your interest.
Thanks again for joining us for the last episode of the spring semester for Pod and Man at Yale. Subscribe if you haven't already, and look out for our next episode coming in the fall. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.